Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Information Studies 753 Preserving Information Media lecture, Assessing the Environment and Collections. So here are weekly topics for this week. What are the benefits of assessing preservation environments? What kind of considerations must be made when assessing environments? How can archivists include assessment of the collection into preservation? And what are the benefits of doing so? So we'll be focusing on a few different stages or types of assessment. So assessment during appraisal, assessment during ingest, assessment as the result of special projects, which the Harry and Gutselman article in particular focus on, and ongoing assessment. So it's important to consider that in a lot of archives, the only time that the preservation challenges that a collection might face are really examined or considered are during ingest and as the records are interacted with by archivists. A lot of the time, archivists aren't going to have the resources to do a lot of appraisal of records for preservation issues before they come into the repository, especially for collections that are really large. It may just be that the archivist only has a certain amount of time to look at the collection. Say the collection is at risk of being disposed of, and so archivists need to swoop in and decide pretty quickly about what they're going to take. And so they may not have the time to just spend a lot of time looking at the collection and learning about preservation issues that the collection is facing. It may be that a collection is very large, and so the archives just doesn't have time to have a staff member available that can really take an in-depth look at the collection and preservation risks that are included in it. It may just be that the donor isn't interested in allowing the archives to look at the collection. They just want to get rid of it, and they don't want to have someone coming to kind of peer into their windows and see, if they can spot mold on records. Or there are a lot of issues that that can prevent archivists becoming aware of preservation issues during appraisal and before the records actually end up in the archive. And not every archive can engage in the types of special projects that the Gunselman and the Harry articles focus on. There can be a lot of reasons for this. A lack of resources is a big one, which is kind of a recurring theme for archives. So oftentimes the only time that an archive really looks at collections and thus may become aware of preservation issues that a collection faces might be during ingest, and probably to a lesser degree as the collections are interacted with and used by researchers. And even during ingest, depending on how the ingest is carried out, archives may not necessarily take a close look at the collection, and thus it might be possible that a lot of preservation issues might go undiscovered. If archives are taking more of an MPLP approach towards processing collections, then it may be the case that they're not taking a lot of time to look at the collection material very closely, and thus they may not be aware of preservation issues that the records are facing. And this ongoing interaction might result in an awareness of preservation issues that is pretty superficial as well. Unless the archives has some kind of built-in monitoring strategy or program. So in the Harry article, they talked about how they have student workers go through every single collection each year to see, you know, that everything is where it should be, and to take at least a cursory glance at any preservation issues that are going on. So that would be good ongoing preservation monitoring and preservation assessment. If an archives has a way to monitor the environment that collections are being held in, which is what the Trinkhaus-Randall article really focuses on, then that would be a good way to have an idea of how well records are being preserved. So if records are in an environment that suits their nature, then you can be pretty confident that because you're assessing the environment that these collections are in, that the collections are going to be maintained over time. So those are some good examples of ongoing assessment. Of course, not every archive can do that. Not every archive can have a way to monitor the environment that its collections are in. It's just, again, a simple fact of resources, and not every archive can have enough student workers to go through every single collection each year to kind of peer in and see if there are any preservation issues that seem significant. So it may just be, as in the Gunselman article, where archivists mostly become aware of preservation issues as researchers or as archivists are working with the collection. So if a researcher is in the reading room, they might say, hey, you know, it looks like this paper is really thin and brittle. Or as an archivist is answering a reference request and working with collections that way, they might say, okay, it looks like these records have some issues going on, so let's try and take care of them. And, you know, that can result in really sporadic and intermittent assessment, because it may be pretty infrequently that you are working with a collection enough to discover preservation risks associated with it. That may happen, you know, every few months, every few years, who knows? So obviously this isn't an ideal type of assessment, but it may be the only type of assessment that archives are capable of carrying out, which is obviously unfortunate, but again, archives have to do what they can with what they have, and you know, sometimes that's just the reality of the situation. So there are a few main benefits for carrying out preservation and assessment. So a big one is just knowing the nature of the collection or collections in your repository and any potential risks that it might face. So just having a greater awareness of the different types of records that are in your collections, and once you know that, having a greater idea of what types of risks your records are faced with. So if you carry out a survey or some kind of assessment and discover that you have glass plate negatives that you didn't know of, then you know, okay, well, these might be a risk of shattering, they might be a risk of deteriorating due to exposure to light. And now that we know that, you know, we're able to have a greater understanding of the environmental risks that a collection faces. We're able to have an awareness of how the environment that records are in may be contributing to preservation problems. And having this awareness can allow you to reduce the deterioration that your records are facing. If you discover that you have cassette tapes in a collection that you didn't know about, you become aware to the potential risks that those cassette tapes face. You become aware of the environmental risks that are associated with cassette tapes, and you're able to take steps to reduce the deterioration of those cassettes over time. So whether by placing them in an environment which is more conducive to the long-term survival of cassettes, or just putting them in boxes that are going to make it more likely that they aren't damaged if a box falls off the shelf, or whatever steps you take. Um, you know, forewarned is forearmed, and if you know what's in your collection and what risks those collections face, then you can take steps to reduce the likelihood that those negative outcomes are going to happen, and you'll be able to reduce the deterioration that your records are undergoing or will undergo. It's important to realize that assessment must be turned into action. Once you know what records are in your collection and what risks they face, once you realize that your cassette tapes are not in an environment that is conducive to their long-term survival, then you actually need to do something about it. You need to put them in an environment which is more conducive to their long-term survival. Or maybe you need to work to have them digitized and the content saved in that way. So it's really useless to do an assessment and not follow that up with any plan or any type of action to make this situation better. It's like, congratulations, you just wasted a lot of time and a lot of money to figure out something is wrong, but you're not actually going to do anything about it. So there has to be follow-up to assessment. That's a really key part of the equation. So, there are a few different actions that archives could take. They could set advocacy goals. They could decide, okay, we've discovered that a lot of our materials aren't in an environment that they need to be in. They're not in an environment which is going to help them be preserved over time. So let's try and reach out to people that might be in a position to give us funding in order to have better climate control on our stacks. Another action might be developing grant proposals and attempting to get the resources your archives needs to better preserve things that way. If you don't have evidence that there's a problem, then it's going to be difficult to convince someone to give you the resources that you need to solve that problem, right? And surveys and assessments can serve as a great piece of evidence. And it's something that you can take to granting agencies, you can take to resource allocators and say, hey, look, we've gone through, this percentage of our collections, and we've discovered that we have a lot of collection material that isn't being preserved correctly. Here's the, the X's and O's of that. And we would really like to have the resources made available to us so that we can prevent these records from deteriorating further or deteriorating in the future. Another good thing that assessment and surveys can allow your archive to do is to develop a preservation plan, which is something that we talked about before in this semester. And actually doing this type of survey is really a key part of developing a preservation plan. It's going to tell you, here's how you need to handle records in this archive. So here are the records that we have, and here's how we should take care of them. But if you don't know what you have, then it's really difficult to formulate how to take care of it, right? And so doing this assessment is a critical part of developing the preservation plans, which we talked about earlier on in the semester. So there are a lot of benefits to doing these types of assessments, but again, you actually have to take what you've learned and be proactive about addressing the issues that you find. Again, otherwise, you're just kind of spinning your wheels and wasting your money, uh, which is not something that a lot of archives have the luxury of doing very often. So what we'll do for the rest of the lecture is we'll talk about these different stages of assessment, and we'll connect them with some of the concepts or aspects of preservation that we have talked about in this course. So we'll start by talking about assessment during appraisal, then we'll do during ingest, during special projects, and ongoing assessment. So assessment during appraisal. How can we connect this with some of the aspects of digital preservation that we have talked about in this semester? So we'll start by connecting preservation assessment during appraisal with access and authenticity. Obviously, records that are damaged are less likely to be accessible in the future. So that's something that you should think about when you are appraising records from a preservation standpoint. So, wow, this paper is really brittle already. That's really going to limit the ability of our researchers to work with these records in the future. So maybe that means that we shouldn't take these records since it's going to be, difficult to get a lot of use out of them. And you can also argue that records that have been damaged have a lower level of authenticity. So maybe an image on a picture is warped over time. Maybe a cassette has been in a moist environment and the recording on it is all wonky and messed up. And that might be something that you consider when you're appraising for preservation as well. So these records are really damaged. Are they really going to be an authentic representation of what they were like when the original creator created and used them, or have they been so damaged that it's a really inauthentic representation of the content of the record? Looking at documentation, your appraisal decisions should be documented. So if you're saying we're not going to take this collection for preservation reasons, you should talk about why they are, at least generally, and make sure that that's recorded in the future. And the appraisal decisions that you make should be based on policies that your archive has developed over time. So it shouldn't be just kind of a random, willy-nilly decision that you're making. It should be an appraisal decision that is based on, policies or precedents that your archive has engaged with and used previously. Storage, obviously, poor storage by donors can result in more of a need to preserve records, or to appraise based on preservation. So if records have been kept in very poor storage conditions, then the need to do this type of appraisal might be more prominent. And that's something that the Hackbart-Dean article touches on. Sustainability, again, as I talked about before, not every archive has the resources to send someone out and spend a lot of time looking at collection material for preservation issues before the records are owned by the archive or come into the archive. So that can be a big barrier to this type of assessment going on, is just a lack of staff members or a lack of time the archive has to to make decisions about appraisal based on uh, preservation before the records come into the repository. And collaboration, obviously it takes collaboration between the archives and the donor for this type of appraisal to happen. It takes, the donor's time to work with the archives and, let them know about the type of conditions that the records were kept in. It takes time, it takes collaboration with the donor for them to let an archivist come to their warehouse or their house or storage unit or whatever to look at the records. And sometimes that collaboration takes place and it's great. Other times it doesn't take place. And again, that can be another reason why this type of assessment during appraisal might be difficult to actually happen. So some connections to some of the different aspects of archiving, connecting to outreach. If archives do reach out to potential donors and let them know why this type of assessment is important, then that may make it more likely that archives are allowed into someone's home or into someone's basement or whatever to conduct this type of assessment. It may be an easy sell, it may be a tough sell, but the more a person understands about archives and what archives try to do and why archives are important, the more likely they may be to facilitate this type of assessment taking place. So that would be a good connection outreach. Obviously, with appraisal, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Connections to researcher services. Every time archives say we're not going to take records for whatever reason, including preservation reasons, then those records aren't available to researchers in the future. And that can have a pretty big impact on things like social memory and also records that are available for archivists to connect with researchers in the future. If archives decide to accept records that are in poor condition, then again, that may limit the ability of reference staff and researchers to interact with the records, and that can have an impact on researcher services as well. And it can have an impact on processing too. So if you are an archivist and you're attempting to process records that are in poor condition, that may limit your ability to really work with the records and get to learn a lot about them. You might be afraid to handle them because of additional damage done to the record. And that might be something that can be considered during assessment during appraisal as well. How much are we able to actually interact with these records and learn anything about them? Are they so fragile that we really won't be able to process them that much? And thus, the exact contents of these records might be kind of a mystery. If so, how does that impact our appraisal choices? And finally, social justice. Another thing that archives can consider when assessing the preservation state of records during appraisal is how well will archives be able to preserve records in a way that meets the needs and expectations of members of a particular community. So if a community for cultural reasons, expects that records that an archives takes will be maintained very scrupulously because the records are very important to a community. It may be a Torah from a synagogue, or just really any record that has cultural significance to a community. If an archives can't pledge to maintain records very carefully and very scrupulously because they don't have the resources to do so, then that's something that archives might consider when assessing the preservation status or the status of records during appraisal too. The last thing that you want to do is accept the important records of a community and then not really be able to maintain it in a way that the community feels is appropriate, because that's kind of a slap in the face and is saying, well, your records really aren't that important. um, and that's obviously not what archives want to communicate to really anyone, but especially to communities that have been marginalized in the past. Okay, so next we'll talk about preservation during ingest. So our next sort of phase of possible assessment. And this can be a period that can be quite some time. So it might be a while for uh, it might be a long period during which records are brought into a repository and eventually processed and made available for researchers. So that's kind of what I'm considering the ingest stage here. The acquisition and accessioning stage, and also the stage where records are arranged and described. I know NPLP suggests making records available even before they have been sort of fully ingested by the archives. I won't really comment on that too much here, but that's what I'm defining as the ingest stage for the sake of this discussion. So obviously, if this ingest stage is one in which archives make a careful note of the condition of records, that can improve the ultimate level of access and authenticity that records enjoy. So if archives take a lot of time to assess the conditions of records as they are accessioning, as they are arranging and describing them, that can result in records that uh, deteriorate less rapidly, and due to that, the records are more accessible for a longer amount of time in their most authentic state. If archives do more of an NPLP type of arrangement and description, and the records really aren't looked at that closely at all, then it can result in records that have preservation issues going on that archivists aren't aware of or ignore, and that can impact the ultimate level of access and authenticity that records can enjoy. This is especially true with AV records, which the Harry article focuses on. And the Harry article talks about the difficulties of preserving AV records, which we'll talk more about next week. But especially with AV records, if they are kind of ignored or remain hidden for years at a time before they get any kind of preservation concern or attention, then that can really impact the accessibility and authenticity of that particular type of record. Documentation is an important aspect of this type of assessment as well. The condition of records should be documented during ingest. So as an archivist is accessioning records and arranging and describing records, they really ought to take note of any preservation concerns that they see going on, even if they're not able to address them right then and there. At least there's going to be some record that ideally will result in the records being that will result in preservation risks to records being addressed in the future. And again, that's just going to result in records being given the preservation attention that they need, and it's going to reduce the deterioration, or at least reduce the rate of deterioration of the records over time. Sustainability is a big part of this type of assessment as well. You know, not every archive can spend a lot of time during ingest to go through every single record and every single collection. It's just not possible. That's why MPLP is such a big thing in archives, because archives oftentimes don't have the resources to uh, sort of scrupulously document and scrupulously look through every single record and the collections that they have. Uh, and so that can make the assessment of records during ingest more difficult for archives to carry out. Again, just because of a lack of manpower, a lack of time, the need to address other collections that might also be in the ingest stage, and of limited utility to researchers. And you know, this is a big barrier towards this type of assessments taking place in a meaningful way. Again, it might be kind of superficial, but to have a really meaningful assessment of the preservation needs and risks that a collection faces during ingest, you know, it does take a lot of resources and infrastructure that an archives may not have. Oh, an interesting one that, so going back a little bit on my diagram here, storage is also an interesting one during ingest. If records are identified during ingest as having some kind of preservation concern that could possibly pose a risk to other records, such as mold or insect contamination or something like that, then they really ought to be stored in a separate area until those risks are addressed. So, you know, that is something that might result from the assessment of records during the ingest and accessioning stage. Ideally, you want to catch these things even before records come into an archive. So that would be ideally something that you would note when you're doing assessment during appraisal, but that doesn't always happen. And it may be that when records are already in the building, you note that they have some kind of preservation concerns, which could possibly pose a risk to other records. And so you should really store them in a place where they're not going to spread to other collections that your repository has. Okay, so let's do some connections to other processes that archives engage with. Obviously, outreach can result in archives having more resources to devote to this type of assessment. So if archives are carrying out advocacy, then that may result in them being able to have the resources to hire more staff members, which can result in more time being spent working with collections and identifying the preservation state or risks associated with a particular collection. Looking at appraisal, if archives are unable to assess the preservation needs of a collection during appraisal, then they may do so during the ingest stage. So this might be an opportunity for some kind of secondary appraisal to go on. And the archives may say, wow, you know, we didn't know that this collection or this part of this collection had these preservation issues before, but now that we're seeing them, you know, maybe we should get rid of these records, or maybe we should rethink if we should take the whole collection. So this might be another opportunity for that kind of decision to take place during this potentially lengthy ingest stage. Researcher services, of course, when you are doing this type of assessment, you want to, again, balance the negatives of keeping a record with the record's overall value for the institution as a piece of evidence, or as an important record for the archive to have. So again, just kind of this balancing act of what are the pros and cons of us keeping this record, and you know, if the cons outweigh the pros, if the ultimate research value of the record isn't thought to be something that outweighs the preservation concerns that come up during assessment during the ingest stage, then you might say, okay, well, we're going to get rid of this collection or get rid of this part of the collection and just kind of move on from there. Obviously, processing is a part of this ingest stage. And with the social justice connection, if you are working with collections and you decide that they shouldn't be kept by the archive for whatever reason, then of course you want to dispose of them in a way that, again, is consistent with the expectations and cultural sensitivities of the donor or of the community that the records came from. So you can, as much as possible, want to respect their wishes. If your assessment during the ingest stage results in you saying, okay, we probably shouldn't keep these records, but let's think about how we can get rid of them in a respectful way, either maybe giving them back to the community and back to the donor and just saying, we can't take these records because we can't care for them, or disposing of them, in a way that that is respectful. Okay, so next we'll talk about assessment during special projects, which is something that the Harry and Gunselman articles focused on quite a bit. I thought those were both pretty interesting articles. So again, engaging in these types of projects are going to result in records that remain accessible and more authentic over time, because again, this type of assessment really is a great way to identify preservation risks that are going on and take steps to reduce the deterioration of records over time. Documentation is an important part of this type of assessment. Of course, you want to document what you find when you are surveying collections during this type of special project. So you want to have some way to record the information that you discover. In the Harry article, they talk about developing a tool to record the type of information that they wanted. The Gunselman article is a little older, so that's more based on paper forms. But you just want to have some way to record what you find, and that way you're not just, okay, well, we see that this problem is going on, and then you don't record it, or anything, positive comes from that realization. So documentation really is an important part of this kind of surveying process. Again, with this type of assessment, sustainability is a huge issue, and it's one that the Harry and Gunselman articles both talk about. So in the Harry article, the author talks about the need to set a minimum level of work that is acceptable. And, again, you don't have an infinite amount of resources to carry out these kinds of surveys or this type of assessment. So you really need to say, okay, what can we do based on the resources that we have, which is, as we've talked about through the semester, the crux of sustainability. And that's certainly true with this type of project. The Harry and Gunselman articles both talk about making use of student workers, so they might be sort of key cogs in making these projects more sustainable. Just having a little bit of extra support, a little bit of extra help in the archive to carry out ambitious surveys and other types of assessment. Of course, student work has its limitations, which the Harry article touches on, about how with AV records, students weren't really familiar with, archaic things like cassettes and VHS tapes and other AV formats that didn't exist when they were born. And when I read that, I really felt old and wanted to die just a little bit, because I grew up listening to cassette tapes in my Ford Escort and watching VHS movies at home. And gosh, it's sad to think that not everyone experienced that kind of joy in life. But especially with formats that student workers may not have a lot of experience with or familiarity with, that may reduce their ability to contribute to uh, a survey that is meant to identify different formats and talk and sort of document the risks that they might be facing. The Gunselman article talked about sampling as a way to make this kind of project more sustainable, especially in the case of materials with homogeneous content. So if you know that a collection is largely paper-based, then you don't need to look at every single box in that collection in order to have an idea of the preservation risks that the collection might be facing. You can say, okay, it looks like boxes 1, 3, 6, 9, and so on are in good shape. So we can just kind of assume that the rest of the collections were, or the rest of the records in this collection are in fairly good shape as well. We can just kind of assume that they all got the same type of preservation care during ingest, that they have been in the same environment. So just kind of looking at a small section of these collections, we have a good idea that that the rest of the collection is going to be okay as well. Of course, this assumes that the archive has a real picture of the contents of collections, which, depending on the amount of arrangement and description that the collection went through, may be debatable. So I was kind of thinking, well, there might be a lot of stuff in these supposedly homogeneous collections that really might be different from other parts of the collection. I think they talked about finding like an animal trap in one of the collections, and I was like, okay, well, how did you not kind of know that this animal trap was in there? But I guess at least in an ideal world, sampling does have value, and again, it is something that can make this type of assessment more sustainable. Collaboration, obviously, uh, collaborating with um, students and student workers can be an important type of, or an important part of projects like this, which we have touched on. Maybe collaborating to work with granting agencies to get some support, which the Gunselman article talks about. Supporting this project with grants, and so that's something that's related to sustainability as well. Looking at our connections to archival processes, an interesting one that kept popping up was appraisal. So the Harry article focused on trying to identify collections that had more value in AV records that had more value, and really focusing on getting more information about those. And for collections that maybe didn't have as much value, not putting as much effort into those records. So that's definitely a type of appraisal, saying we really want to focus on these particular collections because we feel like they are more important for our archive and for our researchers. In the Gunselman article, they talked about giving more attention to important collections as well. So spending more time surveying them, maybe not sampling and looking through the entire collection. Again, simply because there was the opinion, and how well supported that opinion is, who knows, that particular collections had more value and thus were more worthy of greater resources. So just an overall idea of expending the most effort for the most deserving materials. Of course, this can be hard to do without good initial appraisal. How do you really know what's in your collection that that has the most value, especially if your records weren't processed very well. You may not know of important collection material in a collection or in your archive that uh, you should be preserving more carefully or surveying more carefully, um, but you're not because you just don't know that it's there. So, you know, you want your decisions about spending more time assessing particular collections as opposed to other collections being based on solid information and not just someone's hunch or someone's gut instinct that one record or one part of a collection is important and others are not. There are some interesting connections to processing as well. You know, a solid description, as I talked about, is an important starting piece to this kind of survey and this type of assessment uh, being possible or taking place. So, ideally, you have some way to identify where possible preservation risks are present. So, if you have a collection that has been arranged and described very well, and you have a good finding aid that says, well, there are AV materials in these boxes in this collection, then you can go right there and find those things and say, okay, well, it looks like we need to keep better track of these. But if you don't have a good finding aid or good arrangement and description, then it can be more laborious to try and find potentially risky records when you're doing this type of survey. So again, good processing can be a really important part of preservation in general, and in this type of preservation assessment being successful and honestly more efficient and sustainable. What was interesting is the Gunselman article talked about how the information that they discovered during their survey was used to provide additional description to collections. So as they were working with the collections and interacting with them more and learning more about them, they thought, okay, well, this is great information. Let's add it to the finding aid. And that was kind of an unexpected bonus that they talked about. Okay, so last but not least, we will talk about ongoing assessment. So assessment that takes place sort of into the indefinite future. So I talked about the shelf audits at BYU, where the students would look into uh, different boxes every year to see what kind of efforts were going, or what kind of preservation concerns might be going on. I talked about environmental monitoring and reference work. So these are all types of ongoing assessment that can take place. Again, they might take place to kind of varying degrees and intermittently unless they're done kind of strategically and comprehensively. So this can either be a really good type of assessment based on regular monitoring and data, or it can be kind of an ad hoc shoot from the hip type of assessment that may be of questionable value. And again, a lot of that can depend on sustainability. So not every archives can afford to have an environmental monitoring system. Not every archives has the resources to have someone go through every single box every single year to see what condition records are in. And so, that can be a big impact on this type of ongoing assessment. Obviously, storage is an important one as well. If you have storage conditions that uh, you know that are poor, then that can have negative impacts on your repository, and obviously that's something that you want to be aware of through ongoing environmental monitoring. Documentation, obviously you want to keep track of the information that you collect during this type of ongoing assessment. If you're doing environmental monitoring, you want to make sure that you are keeping track for any trends in the conditions that your records live in. If you see, during a certain time of the year, your relative humidity spikes, or, the temperature in one of your rooms seems to go up, then, once you're aware of that, you can take steps to correct it. So this type of documentation can really provide a sort of active and ongoing view of the conditions that your records live in. Again, if you're doing the, box by box surveying, the Harry article talks about, obviously you want to document the results of that kind of survey as well. Okay, so some connections here. Appraisal is another one that keeps coming up. If you can't do environmental monitoring for all of your stacks, then maybe you would want to place the records that you think are the most important in an area that you can monitor the environment for. If you can't have a student look at every single box every single year, then maybe you just have them focus on the collections that you feel are the most important, so you can kind of set priorities for which records you want to do more regular and comprehensive ongoing assessment for, which again is certainly a form of appraisal. Some other connections that you can make are outreach can be a big one. Doing environmental monitoring can be expensive. It can result in the need to acquire equipment that can be expensive. And so that's certainly something that can require some outreach and advocacy efforts to make possible. Researcher services, again, this can be a form of ongoing assessment, just having your reference staff aware of the need to identify records that they come across or that the researchers come across as being at risk due to preservation issues. So having some kind of eyes and ears that are working with records regularly that know to say, okay, well, it looks like this record has some preservation issues going on, so let's make sure that we do something about it. So the Gunselman article talked about having things sent to the conservation lab. Just could be as simple as taking staples out or whatever is going on. So researcher services can be a good way to do ongoing assessment, but certainly it shouldn't be the only form of ongoing assessment that your archives keeps track, because again, that kind of interaction can be pretty intermittent and not very regular or comprehensive. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. I think it really is important to do assessment for your collections. As an archive, when you acquire a collection, or even when you express an interest in acquiring a collection, you're making a commitment that, at least to a certain degree, you're going to retain the content and context of that collection into the indefinite future. And if you don't know what kind of issues you are inviting upon yourself, if you don't know what kind of issues your records might be facing over time, then in a lot of ways you're neglecting that responsibility and that obligation. And while doing this type of assessment, really all these types of assessment does involve some resources and some sustainability issues in the long run. Being proactive about finding out what's going on and addressing it sooner rather than later can reduce the need for expensive conservation work or rehabilitation work, or even worse, the loss of the record over time. So it can be a lot to take on. but it certainly is a good investment for archives all over. So I hope it's something that you learn more about. I hope it's something that you consider implementing in your archive when you work in an archive in the future. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions.